Hi everyone and welcome along to this session. My name is Arron Hutchinson. I am the Director for Education Training at the ADHD Foundation, and today's session is based on probably one of the most common questions I get asked, which is what is ADHD? Now, there is no simple answer to this question, hence why we've got a full session unpicking this. My hope by the end of this session is that we can start to get a little bit more of an understanding of what the condition actually is, as well as what we can do to support our children who may have the condition, may be diagnosed, or may be showing some traits of ADHD. So in terms of what we're going to cover, we're firstly going to have a little look at what ADHD is, but also what ADHD isn't, because there are a fair few myths and misconceptions about the condition. So we're going to have a little look at those and sort of unpick what's fact, what's fiction about ADHD. We'll look at the diagnostic criteria and the three categories that are on there, which include inattention, impulsivity, and hyperactivity. We're also going to look at a few other areas that are not explicitly on the diagnostic criteria for ADHD, but do affect a lot of people with the condition. One of those areas is executive functioning, a set of skills that we all use on a daily basis that we'll go into a little bit later on, as well as emotional regulation, that ability to manage and control our emotions, and a few other areas that may be impacted by ADHD, including sleep and diet as well. As we go through, we will look at a variety of support strategies in order for you to best support your child who may or may not have some of these challenges. Now, just to kind of start us off, a very brief overview of what ADHD is. This is what we are going to cover. It is a neurodevelopmental condition, which means it's to do with how our brain develops. And before we go into some of the challenges around ADHD, I just wanted to touch a little bit on some of the positives that are usually associated with the condition. Now, of course, everyone presents differently, but I think we often focus on the challenges and the negatives, but there are actually an awful lot of positives that can come with ADHD as well. If we think about impulsivity, for example, and we think about someone who's not necessarily thinking things through before they do them, before they say them, this can, of course, create some challenges, but we can also reframe that and think of that person as someone who's really spontaneous and really quick on their feet. Both good traits to have if sort of used in an appropriate setting. Someone who's hyperactive, we might see them as really energetic, really enthusiastic. So again, some positive traits amongst many others there, as you can see as well. And I think that's one of the best ways that we can support a child with ADHD is actually helping to reframe the way they think about their own brain and the way that they think about the condition. Often we might focus on the negatives, and often if I ask children, what do you know about ADHD? They tend to focus on the negatives. And actually, one of my main roles is to try and reframe that and help children with ADHD to see the positives and see the strengths of having the condition as well. Now, there are some myths and misconceptions around ADHD. The first one, I remember I was told by someone when I was diagnosed with ADHD at 27, I was told you can't have ADHD, you did quite well at school. Now, there's no link between ADHD and IQ or intelligence. There's no connection between those things at all. Of course, ADHD can create some barriers to learning. If you struggle with attention, you struggle with organisation, it can get in the way of learning sometimes, but it does not mean that someone with ADHD doesn't have the ability to learn. It doesn't affect more boys than girls either, which is quite interesting because the diagnostic statistics suggest otherwise. So at the moment, there's around a 3-to-1 diagnosis ratio in favour of boys for ADHD in childhood. In adulthood, it's around 2-to-1 in favour of men. So this is quite a significant jump, and it doesn't mean that women develop ADHD when they get older. It means that we're probably missing them when they're younger, and there's lots of reasons for that, which we're going to touch on shortly. ADHD is not a naughty child syndrome, which is something I've heard in the past. Firstly, there are many children with ADHD who won't have any issues with behaviour, and if we see it as this naughty child syndrome, they are going to continue to get missed. Now, there are presentations of ADHD which can cause challenges with behaviour. Sometimes if we think about impulsivity and emotional dysregulation, Those two combined might lead to some tricky situations for someone with ADHD, but it is not inherently a naughty child syndrome, and we can manage our impulsivity, we can manage our ability to regulate our emotions. Doesn't mean it's ever going to be perfect. There are things we can do to try and support our children and support ourselves with the condition as well. It's not overdiagnosed either. Now, this is something we hear an awful lot of in the media and newspapers and things like that. People saying it's a bandwagon condition and people are jumping on the bandwagon and everyone's got it these days. It's just not true. There is no evidence whatsoever to prove that ADHD is overdiagnosed. If anything, what we're seeing now is a more accurate diagnosis than we've had in the past. So it's not that we're now overdiagnosing ADHD, it's that historically it's been pretty underdiagnosed. We're now maybe seeing a little bit more of an accurate reflection of the condition because we understand a lot more about it now and research is improving as we speak. It's not over medicated either, which is something I've heard people say before. Is it just an excuse for people to get on pills to make them behave? And firstly, if your child is medicated, you'll know firsthand that is absolutely not how the medication works. And secondly, not everyone with ADHD accesses medication either. So it's not this thing that people are diagnosing or getting diagnosed with so that they can access medication. But actually, I think one of the biggest misconceptions about ADHD comes from the name itself. So ADHD stands for Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. Now, I have a little bit of an issue with that word disorder personally, as I feel it just sort of implies like there's something wrong with the person or there's some sort of error, they're disordered in some way. But actually, if your child does have ADHD, that first bit you'll know probably isn't accurate and probably isn't fit for purpose, that attention deficit. In my opinion, attention deficit implies that something is lacking. It's like you have a lack of attention, you're unable to pay attention, and you will know full well from your child they absolutely can pay attention, especially when they're engaged and interested in something, and we call that hyperfocus. For me personally, I would say it's not necessarily a deficit of attention. It's not that I can't pay attention. If anything, it's probably the opposite of that, in that I almost pay attention too much and I pay attention to everything. And the challenge I have is regulating that attention. So filtering out the things that I don't need to pay attention to and focusing in on the things that I do need to pay attention to. So it's maybe more of a dysregulation than a deficit, and it's a condition, not a disorder. As again, as I said, I feel like disorder just sort of has quite negative connotations there. A great description of the condition actually comes from someone called Dr. Ned Hallowell, who describes his ADHD brain as having sort of two parts. So he says the first part that he's got is a Ferrari engine. So it's so capable, it's going so fast, there's so much happening all the time, which is great. Unfortunately, he's got bicycle brakes to manage that engine. So there's so much potential there and there's so much happening. The challenge for him is filtering that, regulating it, sustaining that attention when he needs to sustain it and all of that sort of stuff. So it's not necessarily a deficit, it's more of that dysregulation. Another interesting link with ADHD is something that we call dopamine. Now, you've probably heard of dopamine before. Dopamine is our reward-based neurotransmitter. So it's what gives us our sense of reward. So if you've had a really busy Sunday, for example, where you've had loads of errands to run, you've needed to clean the house, you needed to run the tip, you need to do loads of stuff. You sit down on the couch at the end of the day and you might feel quite relaxed, you might feel quite content because your brain is rewarding you for completing those tasks. That's dopamine in action. It helps us to feel like we're being rewarded. It helps us to feel like we've accomplished something in those scenarios. Might also be if you're a to-do list person and you tick something off a list and you feel quite good about yourself, and that motivates you to then go and seek out the next item on the list and seek out that reward again. So that's what dopamine helps us with, to stay motivated, because it gives us that sense of reward when the reward isn't obvious. Now, the challenge for someone with ADHD is that there's thought to be a deficiency of dopamine transmitted in the ADHD brain, which can mean that children with ADHD and adults as well, it can mean that they need more to get that sense of reward. So they might actually be constantly seeking that sense of reward. It's why we can see some children with ADHD who don't seem particularly motivated by long-term goals, where they have to wait for the reward. They need that instant dopamine fix in the now. It's also why we might see children with ADHD who have very fleeting interests, and they move from one thing to another quite quickly. Because when we try something new, we've got the novelty, the excitement of that, we get that dopamine fix, but then when that wears off, they might become unmotivated and they might seek that reward elsewhere, and we might have very fleeting interests and move from one thing to another. So that dopamine seeking is something to consider when we're thinking about our children with ADHD as well. Now, in terms of the diagnostic criteria, there are a few categories. The first one is inattention. Now, we can see on the screen there some examples of what this might look like. The first thing that I will say is that I was a primary school teacher for 5 years before I started working for the ADHD Foundation. And I think if I looked at this list for long enough, I'd probably diagnose every child I've ever taught with ADHD, because of course, all kids do these things. All adults do these things as well. There's no suggestion that they don't. The difference with ADHD, and what's often missed when people talk about ADHD not being a real condition, what's often missed is the severity of this for someone with ADHD. So of course, all kids can fail to follow instructions. All kids can forget things, lose things, make careless mistakes, all of that sort of stuff. But for someone with ADHD, it's likely to be more severe than what would be typical for that stage of their development. So essentially, in comparison to their peers, they're doing these things an awful lot more, and it's having more of a significant impact on them. We've got hyperactivity as well, which is part of this is sort of your stereotypical idea of ADHD, really someone who maybe struggles to sit still. They might be fidgeting, moving, running, climbing, all of that sort of stuff. There are other more subtle presentations of hyperactivity as well. So excessive talk and verbal hyperactivity can be a sign, as well as internal hyperactivity too. So having that brain that just doesn't seem to switch off and it's just constantly going on a motor all the time. And then we've got impulsivity. So someone who struggles to think before they speak, think before they act, which can cause a lot of challenges. It might be someone who interrupts people in conversations all the time, might be someone who seems quite impatient in the classroom, they might be shouting out answers all the time. So impulsivity can cause a lot of challenges as well. Now, what that leaves us with is 3 presentations of ADHD. The first one is predominantly hyperactive impulsive type. So on the diagnostic criteria, these 2 categories here, hyperactivity and impulsivity, are actually grouped together into one category. For someone to be diagnosed, for a child to be diagnosed with predominantly hyperactive impulsive ADHD, they would have to show 6 or more of those characteristics that are having a significant impact across more than one setting, and it would be less than 6 of the inattentive symptoms. Then we've got predominantly inattentive type, which would be a child that shows 6 or more of these, but less than 6 from that hyperactive impulsive category. Now, this is the one that often gets missed. It's the one, it doesn't fit in with the stereotype of ADHD. When people think about ADHD, they usually think about the hyperactivity, the impulsivity, the very sort of obvious presentations, I suppose. Then when we think about someone who's a bit more inattentive, it's a bit more challenging to spot, even if we are looking for it, because it's not as in your face, it's not as blatant as someone who's really hyperactive and impulsive. That predominantly inattentive type is what's historically been known as ADD, attention deficit disorder. Now it's seen as part of the same spectrum of conditions that we would call ADHD. And then we've got combined type, which is 6 or more across all of those categories there. So if your child has ADHD, they may well be diagnosed with a particular type of ADHD. If they are the inattentive type of ADHD, it doesn't always fit in, as I say, with the stereotypes about what the condition is. And something else that I mentioned earlier was this underdiagnosis in girls, especially in childhood. And there's a few reasons for this. Girls tend to have a high level of a missed diagnosis, or sometimes a misdiagnosis, and often we can see women who are diagnosed with ADHD in adulthood have already been diagnosed with anxiety, depression, bipolar disorder, other mental health conditions as well. And we can see, especially in adolescence, when a young girl is having challenges with emotions, we might look more towards the anxiety and the mental health side of things. And with a young boy, we might look towards behaviour. That might lead to conversations about ADHD. Typical age for a diagnosis for a female is late adolescence into adulthood. And one thing that we can see before that is young girls being written written off as hormonal. So again, if they're having challenges with their emotional regulation, they might just be written off as hormonal, and it's not then investigated that it maybe could be something else as well. Lots of studies historically on ADHD and neurodiversity in general have just focused mainly on males, which has furthered this stereotype, furthered this view that these conditions are more prominent in boys than girls. Girls tend to mask more than boys as well, so we will see a lot more young girls who, maybe as one example, they might be presenting in school as if there's no challenges, they're absolutely fine, they're trying not to stand out, but actually when they come home to you, you might see a completely different side, and they're probably putting a lot of energy into masking at school, which is why sometimes we see that extreme emotional response when they get home. The challenge for that, and the reason that that can lead to an underdiagnosis in girls, is because to get a diagnosis, as I mentioned earlier, you have to show those characteristics across more than one setting. So if she's not showing it in school, she's less likely to get a diagnosis than if she is. Now, masking isn't just something that girls do, boys do mask as well, but the research suggests that girls tend to mask more frequently than boys. And just speaking from my experience of working in schools, I absolutely believe this to be true, and it's something I see an awful lot of. Another thing to consider is some of the labels that children, particularly young girls, can get in place of actually looking at it as a sign of ADHD. So if someone's easily distracted, they might be labelled as a bit of a daydreamer. If they appear withdrawn, they might be written off as shy. If they're forgetful, they might be called ditzy. If they're hyper-talkative, they might have been called a chatterbox before. If they're extremely anxious, might call them a worrier. If they have exaggerated emotional responses, they might be called a drama queen. Now, certainly with some of these labels, particularly daydreamer, ditzy, chatterbox, drama queen, I think we tend to give these to young girls more than we do boys. And of course, one of those things on their own isn't going to be enough to warrant a diagnosis of ADHD. But I think all these labels do is just write off the idea that there could be an area of need there. And if we label a young girl as, oh, she's just a chatterbox, she's just ditzy, she's just a drama queen, what we're essentially saying is we don't need to look into that any further. That's just who she is. And particularly with some of those labels that I've mentioned there, I think we tend to give these to young girls more frequently than we do boys, which can lead again to this underdiagnosis. Okay, so I wanted to play this quick video. Now, for anyone who hasn't seen it before, I'll explain what's going on and then what happened afterwards. So in this clip, we have the same boy who does have a diagnosis of ADHD. On the left, he's been asked to read a set of instructions to complete a maths task. And on the right, he's been asked to read a set of instructions to play a Star Wars computer game. Now, bear in mind what I said there, in neither of these clips is he actually doing the task. He's not doing the maths work, he's not playing the game, he's just reading the instructions about it. Now, this is a 10-minute time lapse of both side by side. So I'm just going to play it and see if you can keep your eye on both sides of the screen. Okay, so we can see very clear difference on both sides of the screen there. On the left, he's constantly moving, he's swinging around on his chair. On the right, he does fidget and move a little bit from time to time, but in comparison to the left, he's pretty much sat still. Now, what happened next was they then asked him to go and complete both tasks. And this was to basically test had he read and understood those instructions. Now, both tasks were challenging enough that you would have needed to have read and understood those instructions to be able to get started on them. What was really interesting was, despite those differences in how it looked, he was able to complete both tasks. Now, the difference here is his interest and his engagement in the task at hand. So on the two topics have been chosen very particularly because he's interested in Star Wars, he doesn't particularly like maths. Now, on the right, he's engaged and interested in what he's reading about. He's probably excited to play the game as well. And when we go back to our conversation about dopamine before and that need for stimulation, that need for that dopamine hit, he doesn't need to move as much to get that in this clip because he's already getting his sense of reward because he's engaged and interested in what he's reading about. On the left, he's not as engaged or interested, so he's not moving to distract himself, he's actually moving to help himself to focus. The fact that he swings his chair around and he starts reading upside down is a bit of a sign there as well. Even when his body's facing the other way, he doesn't take his eyes off the screen. The only time he eventually takes his eyes off the screen is at the very end there where it's frozen, and he does look away when he's completed the task. So he's not moving to distract himself, he's actually moving to increase that transmission of dopamine to stimulate himself in order to help him to pay attention further. Now, of course, in a classroom setting, for example, someone swinging around on the chair might not necessarily be ideal because we've got other children in the class as well. It might be at home. If they're doing homework, if they're watching the television, constantly moving might not be helpful for those around them. So there are ways we can help with that need for movement and that need for stimulation without necessarily swinging around on a swivel chair. Now, in terms of movement and exercise, there's lots of things that we can do, and we're going to start going into some general support strategies now. The first thing that I'll say, of course, is that there is no one-size-fits-all approach, and it's going to be different for everyone. So there's no suggestion that anything that I mention is going to work for absolutely everyone with ADHD, but I've tried to put together as many as possible so that we can start to have a little think about it. Whenever our child is, say it's homework, for example, if we can allow them to fidget, we can allow them to move while they're doing that, it can help, and judging it on the outcomes rather than what it looks like. So sometimes it might look like they're not listening, they're not focusing, but actually if we can allow that and see if it works, see if they get the job done, it might be a sign that that's actually helping them as well. Exercise. Now, exercise can be really challenging because we've got that need for movement, but then also when we think about that need for a short-term reward rather than a long-term reward, doesn't fit well with ADHD. So with exercise, for example, there's lots of benefits to exercising, and we'll all know this. We don't kind of start to see those benefits instantly, and it can take a long time. So for someone who needs instant gratification and instant reward, this can be challenging. The best thing we can do is to try and stop someone from getting bored, change up the exercise regime, keep it as fresh as possible. If we've got someone who's kind of reluctant to engage in exercise, we can try and disguise it in other ways. So we're not going for a walk for the sake of going for a walk. We're going for a walk because we need to go to the shop, and we might take the long way round. We might take the dog for a walk, and trying to disguise that exercise where we can if we do have someone who's a little bit reluctant. Around the house, giving physical jobs to do as well. So heavy lifting jobs around the house to keep them moving, keep them stimulated if they need that exercise. Trying to get outside where we can as well. And research has shown that children with access to children who experience more kind of green space, it can really help them with their ADHD. If you're interested, if you have a look on Attitude magazine and type in green space into the search bar, you'll find some of the research on this. Trying to incentivize exercise with rewards wherever we can. So it doesn't necessarily mean that, we'll go for a walk and then we can eat a big chocolate cake, but it might be small little tokenistic rewards when we've completed that exercise, doing what the brain's not doing for them. So giving them that sense of reward once they've done that task. Fitness trackers can be a good way of incentivizing as well. Now, obviously, we can get the very expensive, fancy ones. There are lots of, if we go on Google, lots of cheaper alternatives designed for children around helping them to keep track and incentivize in terms of their fitness regime. So definitely something that's worth having a look at as well. Now, one of the other areas we focused on so far is around impulsivity. So impulse control, there's lots of things that we can do to help our child who might struggle with impulsivity as well. Firstly, for someone who's quite verbally impulsive, so they might, in class, for example, they might be shouting out all the time. At home, they might be interrupting people in conversations all the time, trying to get into the habit of externalizing that impulse elsewhere. And if appropriate, using post-it notes or a notebook can be a great way of doing this. So encouraging your child to, when they feel like they've got to say something, getting into the habit of writing it down and making sure we then go back to it at a later time when it's more appropriate. The more we do this, the more we practice this, the more they'll start to learn that they get that same sense of relief from interrupting and shouting something out because they're worried they're going to forget it. They get that same sense of relief from just externalizing it elsewhere, but it can take a little bit of time to practice, but definitely something I'd recommend. If your child is struggling in school with impulsivity in social situations, and they might become angry quite quickly, or they might say things to people that they don't really mean and they later go on to regret, but they're just very impulsive in those situations. if it's causing challenges, if it's causing issues, I would definitely recommend role playing some situations, playing out appropriate responses and inappropriate responses, because all we're doing is trying to give them that opportunity to practice those skills in so that then they can apply them in the moment as well. For someone who's quite physically impulsive, so they might lash out at siblings, at classmates, using things like resistance bands and stress balls and teaching them to channel that frustration into something else. Non-verbal cues can be a good way of establishing impulse control as well. So having a little cue with your child when you can start to see them losing control a little bit. So there was a young man that I used to teach who I could really start to spot the signs when he was sort of losing control, and it might be that become a little bit overexcited. He might say something silly that would upset someone, or he might actually start to become quite frustrated. He might do something that would get him into more trouble in the long run. So I had this little cue with him, and I said to him, if I catch your eye and I sort of tap twice on my chest like that, that's just my way of saying you're about to lose control. You need to take a step back, count down from 10, do some breathing. And we had lots of different things that we'd use. But that kind of non-verbal signal, which was just tapping twice on my chest like that, was just my subtle way of saying that to him to try and bring him back down into the moment. Now, it didn't work every time, of course, but sometimes he would do it back to me. And if he did it back to me, that was his way of acknowledging what I'd just done and saying, okay, I'll go and do that. So none of these things are going to work every time, but something like that can be a way of trying to buy your child a little bit of extra time for them to kind of think through what they're about to do or say. We can also practice impulse control through games as well. Snap is a good one. So practicing someone to control that need to snap when they don't, when it's not the right time to do it, and trying to get into the habit of learning that skill of, right, how can you stop yourself from doing that? Jenga is a good one as well, and playing sort of the rules of Jenga, where if you touch the block, you then have to take that one. So just trying to teach your child and help them to practice not diving in and rushing into decisions, and slowing things down and stopping and having a little think about what they're about to do. Then in terms of focus and attention, anything we're asking them to do, so any instructions that we're giving them, if we can break things down into smaller pieces as much as possible, especially if they've got to hold their attention for extended periods of time. So it might be that they've got some homework, for example, and there's not many instructions there, but it's going to take them maybe half an hour to do. If we can try and break it up as much as possible, it can really help. The reason why, and if we can follow this up with some sort of to-do list, even better. The reason why is, as we're ticking things off that list, we're giving ourselves that sense of reward. We're essentially reminding our brain, look what I've just done. It gives us that sense of reward. It gives us those little wins along the way. It can help to keep our attention over time. Taking intermittent breaks as well, and it might be that for some children they can sit in front of a piece of homework for half an hour, no issues. For some children, especially children with ADHD, it might be that they need that chunking up, so they can do 10 minutes of focused work, and then they're going to get a 10-minute break and another 10, and then another 10-minute break, and working with what works best for them in terms of chunking time as well. Stuff that I'm sure you're probably already doing. Specific praise and encouragement along the way to try and help with that attention too. Now, there's some general stuff around the hyperactivity, impulsivity, and attention. We're going to have a little look at something called executive functions, which are a set of skills that operate from the part of your brain that's highlighted on the screen there. That's your prefrontal cortex. It sits at the front of your brain here. Now, research has shown structural differences in the prefrontal cortex in children with ADHD, and it's thought that that part of the brain can have around about a 30% delay in its development in children with ADHD, which is going to lead to more significant challenges with some of the skills that operate from that part of the brain. So we've got the first one is impulse control. We've got emotional control, which we're going to come back to. Flexible thinking, that's being able to adapt to unexpected changes. Working memory, which is a type of short-term memory. It's our ability to store information in our mind while also having to do something with that information. So essentially, if someone was to give you a set of verbal instructions, you've got to store that information there in the short term and work with that and work through it in order. The better your working memory is, the more of those instructions you could take on, and the more challenging your working memory is for you, the fewer of those instructions you could take on. Then we got self-monitoring, so being self-aware, knowing how you come across, knowing how well you're doing at something, knowing whether you're doing a good job, a not so good job, monitoring yourself against the clock and being able to manage your time effectively as well. Then we've got planning and prioritizing, task initiation, just getting started on things, not procrastinating, not avoiding, and then organization as well. Now, all of us, whether we've got ADHD or not, all of us are going to have our own strengths and challenges with these skills, but for children with ADHD, because of that roughly 30% delay of the prefrontal cortex, we're probably going to see some more significant challenges with some of these executive functions, and you may well recognize it in your child. Some things that we can do to help if they do have challenges with this. The first thing, we've kind of mentioned this already, using to-do lists, using organizational tools to help can be a really great way of supporting someone who struggles with their executive functions, allowing the technology to do it for us. And I've picked out a few there that might be useful because there are a lot of different kind of apps and tools out there. I've picked out a few that are quite ADHD friendly and quite stripped back and simple to use. Physical reminders of things as well. I'm trying to get into the habit of getting the clothes out the night before, so we're ready to go in the morning. We already feel organized when we wake up. We can kind of start having those wins straight away, and we're not spending the morning stressed trying to find things, and trying to get into that habit can really help as well. In terms of organization, there's an element of organization that's internal as well. So organizing our thoughts, being able to process things. So it might be that someone with ADHD might need a little bit of extra processing time. So we might say something to them, we might ask them a question. They might just need a little bit longer to process that information. Using digital timers and clocks and using countdown timers. There's one that I'd recommend called 360 thinking, which allows you to chunk the clock up into different segments, but using those visual cues to help someone who struggles with time management as well. If we can, following up verbal instruction with written instructions. So when we're asking them to do something, if we can have a little kind of bullet pointed list, a little follow up using visuals can really help with someone who struggles with their working memory. Sticking to routines where possible for someone who has challenges with flexible thinking, using visual timetables. There's an app called Brilli Routines that I would recommend if you wanted to use the technology to support with that. And lots of other ideas there as well for someone who struggles with memory, using recording devices. So it might be using the Voice Memos app on a phone or an iPad so that they can remind themselves of things if they have thoughts that come and go quickly, getting into that habit of recording it down. You can buy something online called a talking tin, which is just a little red plastic box. You can press and hold and talk into it. Again, for someone who their thoughts come in and then it's gone, they can quickly record it and then it's there. The other thing I like recording devices for is for someone who, say they're doing a piece of work, for example, they're doing some homework, and they can sort of think of a great idea and say a great idea. By the time it comes to getting it onto paper, it's completely gone. Using recording devices can help with that as well. So they can record their ideas down, listen back to it before they then get it on the page. A couple of other areas I wanted to mention on sleep can be a challenge for lots of people with ADHD. Various reasons for this. Some general stuff in terms of helping with sleep. Of course, we might have tried a lot of this already. None of it's going to help everyone, but just general advice around sleep. Daily exercise is really key. And if someone isn't sleeping very well, first thing I always want to check is how much exercise are they getting, and we'll find if we do increase that exercise, it can, for some people, help with that ability to sleep. Screen time is a controversial one when it comes to sleep, and I think we're all guilty of this as adults, but the research suggests that those who turn their screens off an hour before they go to bed to limit that exposure to blue light are likely to be able to sleep better than those who are sat on their phones or iPads in bed. And I know that's a lot easier said than done in terms of getting your child to come off their phone at night, but it's just something to be aware of and something to know about. Thinking about the sensory environment as well. So some children might need complete darkness and blackout curtains. Some children might need a little bit of light, and using something like a sensory projector can help with that as well, or a bit of white noise to drown out a little bit of sound too. Getting into the habit of journaling before bed, and I often do this with children. So if we've got a particularly anxious child, if they're going to bed on high alert, worrying about things, if we can get into that practice of externalizing those worries, writing it down, drawing it, doing what you need to do, however you want to express it before you go to bed, to try and kind of clear it off your mind and help with that sleep when we are trying to get to sleep. And keeping a sleep diary is something that I definitely recommend as well. So keeping track of how well they're sleeping each night, and we can also then keep track of what they were eating during the day, what time they turn their phone off, all of that sort of stuff. But there's loads of examples of sleep diaries online. Definitely something I'd recommend having a look at as well. In terms of diet, again, diet can be challenging. We might have someone who's a particularly picky eater. We might have someone who's quite an impulsive eater. For anyone who is a little bit of a picky eater, trying to introduce new tastes and textures gradually, trying to involve them with the meal planning and prep can help as well. And trying to avoid, for anyone who is quite impulsive, especially with things like sugar, trying to avoid blanket bans. It might be tempting. They're unlikely to work, and it's thought to be much more effective to start to teach when and where and teach that moderation. Sometimes we might have someone who overeats because they've got a lot of energy that they need to put somewhere, and actually finding other creative outlets for that energy can help sometimes as well. Wherever we can, provide in options. It might be that we have display boards to avoid surprises, so that they can see what's coming each night, they can see what's coming through the week, they know what they're eating. And I'm fully aware we're not all blessed with time to be able to do that, of course, but just some general considerations there. Few other things I wanted to touch on before we finish is just around emotional regulation and ADHD. And we know that a lot of young people with ADHD can have a lot of challenges with their ability to regulate their emotions. There's something that's often associated with the condition called rejection sensitive dysphoria. So we might have someone who is very sensitive to rejection, and they might, the way someone words something, they might get an incorrect mark on something, the way somebody looks at them, they might become very sensitive to that, and they might actually feel like they're being rejected and pushed out all the time. Something to be mindful of when we're thinking about people with ADHD and their ability to regulate their emotions is this might be something they're contending with as well. And we'll often see this emotional curve here. So when we're at the bottom, that's when we're calm and we're thinking rationally. There might be some sort of trigger that can sometimes lead to the top of that curve there, which is the breakdown and the complete loss of rational thinking. What happens there is when we reach that top point, we've usually activated our fight, flight, or freeze response, which means we're then operating from the limbic part of our brain, which is not rational, is not logical. We're not really able to reason with people. We're not really able to think logically. And when we are there, it's actually much better to just have space to be up there. So when we do see this in our children, when they reach that top point, the best thing that we can do is actually just give them the space to be up there. They might say things they go on to regret. They might do things they go on to regret. But if we start talking about consequences and things like that, at this point, it's likely to add to the threat and keep them up there for longer. Doesn't mean that we're not going to talk about consequences. It's just about the timing of that. And when they're calm and thinking rationally again, they're in a much better position to be able to be reasonable, to able to rationalize things and be able to have that reflective conversation with us. Now, of course, where safety is a concern, then that would trump everything, and maybe a more direct intervention would be necessary at the top there. But if safety isn't a concern, it's much better to actually just give them the space to. They might say things, they might swear, they might call us all kinds. Doesn't mean that we're not addressing that. It's just about the timing of addressing that and waiting until they feel calm again. Obviously, we want to try and stop them from getting to that point at all. So one thing we can do is try and help them to recognize their fight, flight, or freeze response. And I like to use a template like this to help with that. So a body outline like this, and I might say to children, we might pick an emotion and say exactly where in your body do you feel it. So it might be that they feel butterflies in their stomach when they get anxious. It might that they might feel a tightness of their chest when they get angry. It's completely kind of personal to them. What we're essentially trying to do is help them to recognize that sign in the future as a signal that they then need to go and do something to help themselves to calm down. In terms of what they can do, we might use relaxation strategies. We might do something like take 5 breathing, where you take your hand like this and you trace around with your finger from your other hand, and as you go up, you breathe in through your nose. As you go down, you breathe out through your mouth. We might do square breathing, where we find a square or a rectangle and do the same thing and just trace round and breathe in, breathe out, breathe in, breathe out, and do it that way. But having that focus can help with that as well. And there's lots of resources online that we can find in terms of children's mental health too that I would definitely recommend. I'll put that in there as well. Some children might need a more physical response. So some children might need some grounding techniques. So it might be using weighted resources and using deep pressure. It might be kind of that progressive muscle relaxation where we breathe in and tense our muscles, hold, and we breathe out slowly and relax them. It might be that we use some grounding techniques where we're just trying to bring ourselves back down into the moment. So one that I use with younger children is called Count the Colours, where I ask them to choose a colour. So say it's green, for example, and I'd say, right, list all the green things you can see in this room, and they might name them all. And then I'll say, close your eyes and imagine as many green things as you can and just name them as they're coming to your head. And all we're trying to do there is just bring them back down into the moment, give them something else to focus on to try and stop them reaching the top of that curve there. Countdown from 5 is a similar one, where we start on 5 and we'll say, right, tell me 5 things you can see, 4 things you can hear, 3 things you can smell, 2 things you can touch, and then the 1 is just we take 1 deep breath. And again, all we're trying to do is just bring them back down into the now and try and give them a bit of time, distract them, stop them reaching the top of that emotional curve there. The other thing that I would definitely recommend too is, if they do reach the top of that curve, that's okay. And when they are down here and thinking rationally again, having other resources to work through with them to reflect on what's gone on can be really helpful. Often when we're having a conversation with a child and we're trying to ask what led you to that point, what happened, how did you feel? If we're just having that one-to-one conversation with some children, we might not get much response from them. What I would recommend is using some sort of framework, using some sort of resource. And if you go on the ELSA website, ELSA, they've got lots of free resources for children for this very thing in terms of having some of those reflective conversations. So I definitely recommend having a look at that if you feel like that will be something that may help. I'd also say as well, in terms of these strategies, they work just as well for adults as well as children. So if there's anything there that you think, actually, I might have a little go at that myself, I definitely recommend that you have a little look at that and do so. And the final thing I wanted to touch on is focusing on the positives of ADHD and trying to reframe ADHD and talk about the positives. And there are many examples of successful people with ADHD. And when I'm trying to help a child to reframe the way they think about the condition, this is always the point that I start with, and trying to help them to think about the positives and using, and it's not just these people on the screen here, there are so many more, but using those positive examples and successful role models, but also not necessarily just the celebrities and wealthy people, everyday people who are leading very successful lives with ADHD. You might have ADHD yourself, it might be that your child's teacher has ADHD, but focusing on the kind of your everyday run-of-the-mill people as well as all the celebrities and things like that too, can be a really helpful way of trying to reframe it. There are a lot of resources on the ADHD Foundation's website too. So if you go to our website and you click on the resources tab at the top, you'll find lots of our free resources, and you may have seen some of these before. I'm going to pick out a few here. We've got a book called Understanding and Supporting My Child's ADHD, which goes into a lot of what we've been speaking about today, and goes into some of it in a little bit more detail if you are interested. Depending on the age of your child, we have a booklet that's designed to teach teenagers about ADHD and to teach younger children about ADHD as well. You can find them for free on the resources tab of our website, as well as our Umbrella Gang comics as well, which all feature characters that are all neurodiverse. They've all got different conditions, and it can be a really creative way of trying to help children to learn a little bit more about neurodiversity through reading some of those comics. If your child is a little bit younger as well, we do have a lot of early years resources on our website too, both aimed at teachers and at parents. So I definitely recommend having a little look at those as well in terms of some more particular strategies if your child is in the early years. And just to say thank you very much as well. This has been very much a whistle-stop tour of ADHD. I hope you found it useful. I hope you found it interesting. And there's some stuff that we could take away. As I say, please feel free to visit our website for any more information, and the Witherslack Group's website as well, where you'll find lots of free resources and past webinars and things like that on there too. But thank you very much for your time in watching this session, and I hope to see you soon.